He owned nothing. No kin, no shelter, not even decent clothing against the bitter mountain frost. But when Gideon Nash discovered the wounded girl lying in the snow, he made a decision that would bring 30 armed braves to his dwelling within mere hours. What he believed was simple compassion was about to spark something far more perilous than he could have foreseen. The bitter wind sliced through the threadbare fabric of Gideon's tattered shirt as he scaled the jagged slope, his belly aching from starvation. 3 full days without decent food, and the harsh winter was descending rapidly around the mountain summits. At 16, he'd mastered survival through scraps and sheer will, but the coming blizzard threatened to challenge even his weathered endurance. A streak of red against pristine snow stopped him cold. Blood. Fresh blood. Tracking the dark path, Gideon found her, a young tribal girl, perhaps his age, lifeless and bleeding from a severe wound on her leg. Her buckskin garment was shredded, and ice crystals had already started forming on her raven hair. She wouldn't survive another hour in these conditions. Every fiber warned him to keep moving. Interfering with native affairs meant danger, the kind that left settlers dead or worse. But as he gazed at her ashen face, something stronger than self-preservation took hold. "Can't leave you out here," he whispered, dropping beside her. She awakened as he grasped her shoulder, dark eyes flying open with instant terror. Her hand darted to a bone blade at her waist, but frailty made her movements sluggish. "Easy," Gideon said, lifting his palms. "I'm here to help." She spoke quickly in her native dialect, gesturing toward the eastern summits. Even across the language divide, he grasped it. She needed to reach home, and quickly. The girl attempted to rise, but crumpled instantly, screaming as her wounded leg gave way. Gideon grabbed her before she struck the earth, sensing how frigid her flesh had grown. Frostbite was claiming her. "Those summits," he questioned, pointing east. "That's 2 full days through Dead Man's Pass." She acknowledged desperately, frozen tears on her face. Gideon examined his pitiful provisions, barely sufficient nourishment for himself, no healing supplies, and winter clothing that was more tears than material. Guiding her through the peaks would probably kill them both, but abandoning her here would certainly end her life. "All right," he said softly. "We travel together or we don't go at all." For the following 18 hours, Gideon half supported, half pulled the girl across landscape that would test season trackers. She slipped between awareness and unconsciousness, whispering words he couldn't comprehend, but sensed deeply. Urgent pleas maybe, or cautions. When they ultimately arrived at the boundary of her tribal grounds, she managed to stand independently. She forced something into his hand, a small carved stone, before vanishing into the woods without a backward glance. Gideon staggered back to his mountain hollow as sunrise appeared, drained but breathing. He'd chosen correctly, even if it nearly destroyed him. But as he neared his refuge, something froze his blood. Countless hoof marks encircled his cave. Fresh tracks. And etched into the timber beside his doorway was a mark he'd never witnessed before. 3 parallel lines bisected by an arrow. Someone had visited. Someone who knew precisely where to locate him. Gideon circled his hollow 3 times before stepping inside, his palm never releasing the corroded knife at his belt. The hoof marks revealed a tale he didn't wish to interpret. At least 15 mounts, possibly more, all shod in the unique manner he'd observed on tribal ponies. They'd lingered here for hours, examining his meager belongings, studying his habits. Inside the cave, everything appeared exactly as he'd abandoned it. But something felt amiss. His sleeping covering had shifted just barely, but sufficient for someone who knew every fiber of his sparse possessions. His small cooking vessel sat at a changed angle. Even his collection of polished river stones had been touched. They were searching for something, he breathed to the vacant cave. But what could he possibly possess that warriors would desire? He possessed nothing valuable. No precious metal, no arms worth taking, no intelligence about settler activities. Unless his fingers discovered the carved stone the girl had pressed into his grip. In daylight, he could observe it distinctly, polished obsidian rock with elaborate marks carved deeply into its face. It felt heated against his flesh, almost living. A twig cracked outside. Gideon froze, every sinew tightening. That wasn't wind. Something substantial had stepped on brittle wood. Something attempting to move silently, but unsuccessful. Looking through a gap in the stones, his pulse nearly halted. 3 braves sat motionless on their ponies 30 yards distant, observing his cave. War markings streaked their faces, and eagle plumes adorned their black hair. Their gaze never shifted from his hiding place. They knew he was within. How long had they been waiting? How had they tracked him so swiftly? The girl couldn't have informed them. She'd barely been alert when they separated. One brave raised his hand, and somewhere behind Gideon's cave, horses whinnied quietly. More riders. He was encircled. The lead brave dismounted deliberately, his hand settling on a war axe that appeared recently bloodied. When he spoke, his voice traveled easily through the crisp mountain atmosphere. "Boy who aided our daughter, we know you are inside." Gideon's throat turned parched. Daughter. The girl was someone significant, not just any tribal member, but family to whoever these men were. "Come forth. We wish to speak." Every instinct screamed peril. In every tale he'd heard, white men who tangled with native matters ended up scalped or worse. But he was cornered like prey in a burrow with nowhere to flee and winter approaching. The brave continued, his voice carrying an edge that made Gideon's flesh crawl. "You possess something that belongs to us." The carved stone seemed to pulse against his palm. Whatever this object was, it was valuable enough to bring armed men into the peaks, valuable enough to hunt him down within hours. Gideon shut his eyes, feeling the burden of his choice. Step outside and confront whatever these braves wanted, or remain concealed and eventually perish of thirst and cold when winter imprisoned him in the hollow. When he opened his eyes, the lead brave was advancing directly toward his cave opening, and his expression indicated patience was no longer available. Gideon emerged from the cave with his palms raised, the carved stone hidden in his closed fist. 30 braves materialized from behind boulders and timber like shadows gaining form. More men than he'd conceived, all armed, all watching him with expressions he couldn't interpret. The lead brave stopped 5 feet distant, close enough that Gideon could observe the elaborate scars marking his weathered face. This was no ordinary hunting band. These were experienced fighters, and their presence here signified something far graver than a simple rescue. "I am Takakota," the brave said in deliberately measured English. "Ayana is my daughter." Gideon's mouth went dry. A chief's daughter? He'd rescued a chief's daughter unknowingly. And now her father stood before him with sufficient men to destroy a small settlement. "She informed me what you did," Takakota continued, his dark eyes never departing Gideon's face. "How you transported her through the deadly cold when you could have walked away." The other braves remained silent, but Gideon could sense their tension like electricity before a tempest. One mistaken word, one misread gesture, and this encounter would conclude very differently. Anyone would have done the same, Gideon managed, though his voice fractured on the words. Takakota's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "No, most would not. Most fear us excessively to risk assistance." He gestured to his men. "We have been tracking the men who assaulted our camp. 3 settlers armed with rifles who shot my daughter when she attempted to warn them away from our sacred lands." Gideon felt ice crystallize in his stomach. Settlers. White men like him. Men who might presume he was allied with them. "We tracked them to your mountain," Takakota said, his voice growing harder. "Their trail led directly past your hollow. We thought perhaps." He left the sentence hanging, but the suggestion struck Gideon like a physical blow. They'd suspected him of involvement in the assault. "But Ayana described the boy who saved her," Takakota continued. "Thin, starving, with compassionate eyes and gentle hands, not the description of a man who shoots women." Relief washed through Gideon, but it was temporary. If these braves were hunting armed settlers in his territory, blood would flow soon. And when territorial authorities came seeking answers, they'd discover him, the only white face in the region. "The men you're tracking," Gideon said cautiously, "they're still up here?" Takakota nodded grimly. "Close. Very close." They established camp in the valley below, believing they are safe. His hand moved to his war axe. They are mistaken. One of the younger braves spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. Takakota's expression darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Gideon asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to know. "My scout reports smoke rising from their camp. They are cooking fresh meat." Takakota's voice turned deadly quiet. "Meat they stole from families they slaughtered yesterday." The burden of the situation crashed down on Gideon. He was trapped between a war band seeking retribution and desperate outlaws, with nothing remaining to lose. The peaks that had been his sanctuary were about to become a battlefield. Takakota stepped closer, his presence commanding and dangerous. "You saved my daughter's life. For this I offer you choice." Gideon waited, scarcely breathing. "Depart these mountains now, before the sun descends. Ride far and swift, and never return." Takakota's eyes bore into him. "Or remain, and assist us in stopping the men who spill innocent blood on sacred ground." The carved stone felt heavy in Gideon's palm as he realized the impossible position he occupied. Run and spend his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if he'd chosen correctly, or stay and become part of something that could destroy everything he'd built. But as Takakota waited for his answer, gunshots echoed from the valley below. The gunshots reverberated off the mountain walls like thunder, followed by screams that froze Gideon's blood. Not war cries, screams of terror and agony. Takakota's braves instantly transformed from waiting statues into fluid motion, mounting their ponies with practiced efficiency. But Takakota himself remained motionless, his eyes locked on Gideon. "Choose now, boy. The killing has already commenced." Another volley of shots cracked through the atmosphere, closer this time. Someone was racing up the mountain, firing wildly as they climbed through the timber. Gideon glimpsed 3 figures scrambling up the rocky slope, the settlers fleeing toward his cave with desperate panic. "They're coming here," Gideon breathed, realizing the horrible truth. The outlaws knew about his cave. They were leading the fight directly to his doorstep. Takakota's expression turned deadly. "You know these men?" "No," Gideon said quickly. "But they've been observing my camp. They know where I dwell." The lead brave's hand tightened on his weapon. In seconds, armed murderers would reach the hollow, followed by 30 tribal braves seeking blood. Gideon would be caught in the center of a massacre with nowhere to flee. "Position behind the boulders," Takakota commanded his men. "Let them approach." But Gideon saw something that made his stomach drop. One of the fleeing settlers carried a rifle he recognized, a distinctive brass-fitted weapon he'd observed in town. It belonged to Marshal Crawford, the territorial lawman who'd been missing for 2 weeks. These weren't just thieves or claim jumpers. They'd killed a federal marshal. "Wait," Gideon called out as the first settler crashed through the tree line 50 yards below. "If you kill them here, the army will come. They'll blame your people for the marshal's death." Takakota paused, understanding the implications immediately. Dead settlers at a native ambush site would bring cavalry troops and retribution against his entire tribe. The 3 outlaws were close enough now that Gideon could observe their faces, desperate, wild-eyed men with blood on their garments and death in their wake. The leader spotted the cave and pointed, shouting something to his companions. They were going to use his shelter as a fortress. "You cannot permit them to reach the hollow," Takakota said grimly. "If they take position there, we must extract them. Many will perish." Gideon's mind raced. The settlers were 30 seconds from his cave. The braves needed a clear shot, but couldn't risk being blamed for a massacre. And he was the only one who could prevent it from becoming a bloodbath that would destroy innocent lives. The carved stone seemed to pulse in his palm, and suddenly he understood why Ayana had given it to him. It wasn't merely a token of gratitude. It was a symbol of trust, of responsibility. He stepped into the open, directly into the path of the climbing outlaws. "That's far enough," he shouted, raising his hands. The lead settler raised his rifle, finger on the trigger, his eyes wild with desperation and terror. "Get out of the way, boy, or I'll put you down." Behind the boulders, 30 braves drew their weapons silently. waiting for Takakota's signal. One wrong word from Gideon, and the mountain would explode in violence. But instead of stepping aside, Gideon did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Gideon sat down right there in the middle of the confrontation, with rifles pointed at his chest and 30 braves ready to strike. He calmly lowered himself to the earth and crossed his legs like he possessed all the time in the world. "What the hell are you doing?" the lead outlaw snarled, his rifle wavering between Gideon and the boulders where he could sense hidden danger. "Waiting for you to make a choice," Gideon said quietly. "See, you can shoot me, but the moment you pull that trigger, you'll have bigger problems than whatever's chasing you up that mountain." The outlaw's eyes darted around nervously. His two companions reached the rocky outcrop, gasping and bleeding from cuts sustained during their panic descent. They'd lost their mounts, most of their ammunition, and clearly hadn't eaten in days. "We just need to use your hollow for a few hours," the leader said, attempting to sound reasonable. "Then we'll be gone." "That cave belongs to the tribe whose land you're standing on," Gideon replied, pulling out the carved stone. "And they don't take kindly to trespassers." The moment the outlaws saw the tribal artifact, their faces went white. They'd spent sufficient time in the territory to know what it signified. "You're working with them?" the second man gasped. "I'm trying to keep you breathing," Gideon said, "which is more than you deserve after what you did to Marshal Crawford." The leader's rifle snapped back to Gideon. "How do you know about that?" "Because you're carrying his weapon, and his blood is still on your clothes." Gideon's voice stayed steady despite his racing pulse. "Question is, how many other innocent people did you kill on your way up here?" Behind the boulders, Takakota's braves remained hidden but ready. Gideon could sense their presence like coiled springs, waiting for the signal to strike. But he also knew that once the violence commenced, it wouldn't cease until everyone was dead. "Here's what's going to happen," Gideon continued. "You're going to lay down your weapons and surrender to tribal justice, or you're going to keep running and hope you make it to the territorial border before winter kills you." "Like hell," the leader spat. "We're taking that cave." But as he stepped forward, an arrow buried itself in the earth 6 inches from his boot. Then another, then a third, each one closer than the last. The outlaws spun around wildly, attempting to spot the archers, but saw only empty rocks and shifting shadows. Panic began to overtake desperation in their eyes. 30 braves, Gideon said conversationally. "All around you, all with orders to take you alive if possible." He paused. "But they're not feeling particularly merciful after what you did to their families." The truth hit the outlaws like a physical blow. They weren't being pursued by a small hunting band. They'd stumbled into the territory of an entire war party seeking vengeance. "You led us into a trap," the leader accused, his voice cracking. "You led yourselves," Gideon replied, "the moment you chose to spill innocent blood on sacred ground." Another arrow whispered past the second outlaw's ear, and his nerve broke completely. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "I surrender. I surrender." But the leader wasn't finished. With nothing left to lose and madness gleaming in his eyes, he swung his rifle toward Gideon. "If I'm dying today, you're coming with me." The shot echoed across the mountains, but Gideon never felt the bullet. A war axe had already found its mark, and the outlaw leader crumpled to the ground before his finger could fully squeeze the trigger. Takakota emerged from behind the boulders, his remaining braves flowing around the 2 surviving outlaws like water around stones. In seconds, the threat was over. But as Gideon stood up, brushing dirt from his clothes, he realized something that chilled him more than the mountain wind. The gunshot would bring cavalry troops within days. And when they arrived, they discovered dead settlers in tribal territory with Gideon as the only witness to what truly happened. Takakota bound the 2 surviving outlaws with rawhide strips, while his braves searched the bodies. What they discovered confirmed Gideon's worst fears: military dispatches, territorial maps, and a cavalry officer's insignia hidden in the dead leader's pack. "These men killed more than settlers," Takakota said grimly, holding up the officer's bars. "They attacked a military patrol." Gideon's stomach dropped. Killing a marshal was serious enough, But attacking cavalry troops meant the army would dispatch a full company to investigate. They'd follow the trail of destruction directly to this mountain, and when they discovered bodies in tribal territory, they wouldn't ask questions. "How long before soldiers come?" Takakota asked. 3 days, maybe 4, Gideon replied, attempting to calculate distances and army response times. "But when they get here, they'll see dead whites and living natives. Won't matter what truly happened." The chief's weathered face showed no emotion, but Gideon could observe the burden of responsibility in his dark eyes. One wrong decision could bring war to his people, women and children who had nothing to do with this violence. "My braves want to scalp these men and leave their bodies for the soldiers to discover," Takakota said quietly. "Show them what happens to those who assault our families. That'll start a war that'll kill more innocents than these 3 ever could," Gideon said urgently. One of the bound outlaws, a young man barely older than Gideon, began sobbing uncontrollably. "Please don't scalp me. Please. I never killed nobody. I just ran when the shooting started." Takakota studied the crying man with cold calculation. "You ran with murderers. You took their blood money. You are guilty." But something in the young outlaw's terror sparked an idea in Gideon's mind, a desperate plan that might save everyone if he could convince Takakota to trust him completely. What if the soldiers never found bodies at all? Gideon said slowly. Takakota's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "These men were running from something bigger than your warband. They mentioned gold, claim disputes, territorial conflicts. What if they just disappeared? Got lost in the mountains during winter, never to be seen again?" The surviving outlaws' eyes widened in horror as they realized what Gideon was suggesting. "The army would still come searching," Takakota pointed out. "But they'd find my testimony instead of bodies," Gideon said. "I'd tell them the truth. Outlaws came through, got caught in an early blizzard, probably perished somewhere in the deep ravines. Happens every winter." Takakota was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that could determine his people's survival. His braves watched him intently, ready to follow whatever decision he made. "And these 2, he asked, nodding toward the bound men. "They come with us. Your people need witnesses who can confirm that the tribe acted in self-defense, not aggression. When the time comes, they'll tell the truth about who started the killing." The young outlaw nodded frantically. "Yes, I'll tell them everything. How Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping. How my partner shot him when he wouldn't take our bribe. I'll swear to it." But Takakota's expression remained skeptical. White man's word means nothing when spoken against white soldiers. "Maybe," Gideon admitted. "But it's better than starting a war over dead outlaws." A brave approached Takakota and spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. The chief's face darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "Scout reports army dust on the eastern trail. They are already coming." Gideon felt ice form in his veins. "How many?" 20 soldiers, moving swiftly. They had hours, not days. Whatever plan they chose had to happen now, before the cavalry arrived and discovered evidence of the confrontation. Takakota looked from the bodies to his braves to Gideon, the burden of his people's future pressing down on him like the approaching winter storm. Takakota made his decision with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his life balancing war and survival. "We move the bodies to the deep canyon," he commanded his braves. "Make it appear like they fell during a storm." As the braves lifted the dead outlaw, Gideon noticed something that froze his blood. The man's rifle had discharged when he fell, and the bullet had struck the rocky wall of Gideon's cave, leaving a fresh scar in the stone. "The cavalry will see that," Gideon said, pointing to the bullet mark. "They'll know there was a fight here." Takakota examined the damaged stone, his jaw tightening. "Then we make them see something else." The chief barked orders in his native tongue, and his braves immediately began transforming the scene. They scattered cooking gear around the cave entrance, built a small fire pit, and even spread Gideon's few belongings to make it appear like a long-term camp. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked. "Creating a story the soldiers will believe," Takakota replied, pulling out a piece of charcoal. "You have been dwelling here peacefully. The outlaws came, demanded supplies, fired warning shots when you refused. With swift strokes, Takakota darkened the bullet scar until it appeared like old fire damage rather than fresh lead. Other braves scattered brass cartridge cases from an old hunting trip, making it seem that multiple people had been shooting over several days. You fought them off, Takakota continued, but they fled into the storm. You never saw them again. It was a good story, but Gideon spotted a fatal flaw. What about their horses? The cavalry will track them here. Takakota smiled grimly. Their horses died in the canyon with them. Tragic accident. The efficiency was breathtaking. In less than an hour, 30 braves had completely altered the scene, moved 3 bodies to a remote ravine, and created a convincing narrative that would satisfy military investigators. But as they finished, one of the bound outlaws began panicking. "You can't just leave us with him," the older man pleaded, staring at Gideon with desperate eyes. "What happens when the soldiers leave? What happens to us then?" Takakota's expression was unreadable. "That depends on whether you keep your word about telling the truth." The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. The cavalry was closer than expected, their pace indicating urgency rather than routine patrol. "Take positions," Takakota ordered his braves, "but stay hidden until I signal." As his men melted into the landscape, Takakota placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. The gesture was more than tactical, it was acceptance, trust, recognition. "You saved my daughter's life," the chief said quietly. "Today you may save my people's future. This makes you brother to our tribe, if you choose to accept it." Before Gideon could respond, the carved stone in his palm grew warm. He looked down and saw that its symbols had changed in the light, revealing deeper meanings he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a token of gratitude, it was a mark of adoption, of belonging. "I accept," Gideon whispered. Takakota nodded once, then vanished into the rocks as if he'd never been there. 20 cavalry soldiers crested the ridge, their blue uniforms stark against the winter landscape. At their head rode a captain with the weathered look of a career frontier officer, his eyes already scanning for signs of the violence that had brought them here. Gideon stood alone beside his cave, 2 bound outlaws at his feet, preparing to tell a story that would either save an entire tribe or condemn them all. The captain reined in his mount 10 feet away, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Son, I'm Captain Morrison, Territorial Cavalry. We're tracking 3 men who killed a federal marshal and attacked a military convoy. Have you seen them?" Gideon met Captain Morrison's gaze steadily, the carved stone warm in his palm. "I saw them, Captain. 3 men, desperate and dangerous. They came through here 2 days ago, demanding supplies and shelter." The captain dismounted, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the camp. "And I refused to help outlaws," Gideon said simply. "Told them to move on." That's when the shooting started. He pointed to the darkened scar on the cave wall. "Warning shots, trying to scare me into cooperation. When that didn't work, they took what little food I had and headed into the high country." Captain Morrison examined the bullet mark, the scattered brass casings, the signs of struggle. Everything supported Gideon's story. "These the men who were with them?" the captain asked, nodding toward the bound outlaws. "No, sir. These 2 showed up yesterday, half frozen and starving. Said they'd been traveling with the gang, but got separated during a snowstorm in the deep canyon." The older prisoner nodded frantically. "That's right. Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping, but when he wouldn't take our partner's bribe, they shot him. Me and Billy here, we just ran when the killing started." The younger outlaw, Billy, was crying again. "We never wanted anybody to die, Captain. When the shooting started in that canyon, we just kept running. Haven't seen our partners since." Captain Morrison studied their faces carefully. Frontier soldiers learned to read desperation and truth in equal measure. "You're saying your partners are still out there?" "If they're still alive," Billy whispered. "That canyon's a death trap in winter. Nobody could survive up there without proper gear." The captain walked to the edge of the rocky outcrop and stared into the vast wilderness beyond, miles of treacherous terrain, hidden ravines, and early winter storms that could bury men without a trace. "We'll search the area," Morrison decided. "But if they went into the deep country during that storm?" He shrugged. "Nature's got its own justice out here." Gideon felt relief flood through him, but kept his expression neutral. "What about these two? They'll stand trial for their part in Crawford's death, but their cooperation will be noted." The captain mounted his horse. "Son, you did the right thing refusing to help those killers. Took courage." As the cavalry prepared to leave with their prisoners, Captain Morrison paused. "You planning to winter up here alone?" Gideon looked toward the hidden boulders, where he knew Takakota's braves waited. "Actually, Captain, I've been offered a place with some local friends. Good people who know these mountains better than anyone." "Smart choice. These peaks aren't forgiving to men without allies." After the soldiers disappeared down the mountain trail, Takakota emerged from concealment, his braves flowing out of the landscape like morning mist. The chief's weathered face showed something Gideon had never seen before, genuine gratitude mixed with deep respect. "You spoke well, brother," Takakota said, using the tribal word that meant family by choice rather than blood. "Your words have prevented much bloodshed." Gideon held out the carved stone, but Takakota shook his head. "Keep it. You have earned the right." The chief placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. "Our winter camp has room for one more if you choose to stay." Looking back at his empty cave, then at the braves who had accepted him as family, Gideon's decision came easily. "I choose to stay." That evening, as snow began falling on the high peaks, Gideon sat beside a warm fire in the tribal camp, learning his first words in their language, while Ayana translated stories of courage and belonging. The homeless boy, who had nothing, was now a brother to an entire people, his act of simple kindness having transformed not just his own destiny, but prevented a war that could have destroyed countless innocent lives. The carved stone rested in his palm, no longer a mysterious artifact, but a symbol of the family he had gained by choosing compassion over safety, courage over comfort. If you enjoyed this story from Epic Old West Story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to Epic Old West Story.